Imagine waking up one morning and discovering that your religion is now a crime, that the prayer you prayed yesterday could lead you to the gallows today. In 1536, this happened to millions of English people. It wasn't war, it wasn't invasion. It was a king's obsession with a son that turned faith into a death sentence. Neighbors became informers, priests became fugitives, and crosses became proof of treason. 40,000 people marched in protest. Hundreds were hanged in the town squares. Monasteries with a history of 1 year went up in flames. This is the story of the year Henry tore England apart and how a forbidden passion cost the lives of thousands of innocents. But before the bonfires, before the blood in the town squares, there was only a desperate king staring at the cradle of yet another dead son. Henry wasn't born to be king. He was the second son, the spare. But when his brother Arthur died, he inherited not only the crown but also his brother's bride, Catherine of Aragon, daughter of the Catholic monarchs of Spain. The marriage began with hope. Catherine quickly became pregnant. The kingdom celebrated, but the child was stillborn. Then came another son who lived only 52 days. Henry could still smile. He said God was testing them. But when the third child died and the fourth and fifth, the king began to see divine signs everywhere. Doctors whispered in the corridors that the queen's womb was cursed. Theologians questioned whether the marriage was valid in God's eyes. After all, Catherine had been his brother's wife. Leviticus didn't say this was an abomination. Henry clung to this biblical passage like a castaway to a plank. It was then that Anne Boleyn entered the scene. She wasn't the prettiest at court, but she had something Catherine no longer possessed: the promise of a future, dark eyes, a sharp wit, and a calculated refusal to surrender herself to the king. For 6 years she made him wait. 6 years in which Henry begged, wrote love letters, and rearranged the world to have her. "I will not be your mistress," she said. "I will be queen or nothing." And it was that sentence that sealed the fate of thousands. Because to make Diana his queen, Henry needed to get rid of Catherine. And the Pope, pressured by Catherine's nephew, the powerful Emperor Charles V, would never annul the marriage. Rome said no. A three-letter word Henry VI had never heard in his life. How dare an old man in Rome tell the King of England whom he could marry? How dare the Pope stand between him and the son who would save his kingdom? It was then that Thomas Cromwell, his most cunning minister, whispered the poisoned solution. "If the Pope does not annul the marriage, perhaps your Majesty no longer needs the Pope." The idea was simple and monstrous. If Rome did not obey, England would create its own church. In 1534, Parliament passed the Act of Supremacy. With a single signature, 1,000 years of English Catholicism was shattered. Henry was no longer just king. He was God's representative on earth, at least in England. Catherine was banished, Anne was crowned, and the long-awaited child was another girl, Elizabeth. The irony was cruel. Henry had turned the world upside down for an heir who never came, but now there was no turning back. The Rubicon had been crossed, and the blood that would be shed in the name of this decision was about to reach every city, every village, every home in England. Because Henry discovered that declaring himself head of the church was not enough. He needed to make every subject, from the richest to the poorest beggar, swear to accept this new reality. And thus was born the kingdom's cruelest instrument, the oath of supremacy. Imagine the scene. You're at Sunday Mass when soldiers enter the church. The priest is interrupted. An officer unfurls a parchment and announces, "All present must swear there and then before God and their neighbors that the king is the supreme head of the church, that the Pope is an impostor, that the marriage with Anne Boleyn is sacred." You have seconds to decide. To swear is to betray centuries of faith. To refuse is to sign your death warrant. John H., prior of the London Cartwrights, was one of the first to say no. He was a kind man, known for sharing his food with beggars. When he refused to take the oath, he was dragged through the streets of London tied to a wooden grate. At the Tyburn gallows, while still breathing, his chest was split open. His heart was ripped out and shown to the crowd. "Behold the heart of a traitor," the hangman shouted. But the most shocking case was that of Thomas More, the man who had been the king's best friend, who dined at his table, who laughed at his jokes. He died in silence, neither saying yes nor saying no. He thought that by remaining silent he could survive. Henry did not tolerate it, not even silence. At the trial, More finally spoke, "I cannot go against my conscience." Henry could have pardoned him. A gesture, a word, and his friend would live. Instead, he sent a message, telling the executioner to sharpen his axe. On the day of his execution, More ascended the scaffold with a joke on his lips. "Help me up. I'll manage to get down myself." His head was impaled on London Bridge, rotting in the sun for a month until his daughter bribed the guards to bury it. But it wasn't just the famous who suffered. In every parish, royal commissioners appeared with lists. Priests were interrogated. "Do you pray for the Pope?" A wrong answer meant death. Midwives were questioned about whether they baptized babies with the Catholic formula. Teachers had to prove they taught the new doctrine. Fear created a new profession, the professional informer. Men earned coins for every traitor they denounced. Richard Cowley became rich by betraying neighbors who kept rosaries. Margaret Cliterall was crushed to death for hiding priests in her home. She was 30 years old and pregnant. Executions became mandatory public spectacles. Parents were forced to bring their children to watch. "See what happens to traitors," the officials said. But the people saw something else. They saw neighbors dying for praying the wrong way. They saw friends burning for guarding a cross. John Fisher, Bishop of Rochester, was 80 when he was executed. He was so weak that he had to be carried to each falsehood. His crime was to say that the king could not be pope. Before he died, he asked the people to pray for him. Half the crowd knelt. The other half pretended not to see, afraid of being next. In the taverns, no one spoke of religion anymore. In the homes, mothers taught their children to pray silently. In the churches, priests read sermons written by the government, tears streaming down their faces. England had become a prison where the bars were invisible, but everyone could feel them. And the worst was yet to come, for Henry had tasted blood, and it was discovered that besides silencing opponents, killing in the name of God also filled their coffers. The monasteries, with their fertile lands and treasures accumulated over centuries, were the next target. Thomas Cromwell did the math for the king. The Catholic Church owned 1/3 of all land in England. Thousands of golden chalices, libraries with illuminated manuscripts, reliquaries studded with precious stones. "Your Majesty," he whispered, "why does this gold serve Rome when it could serve England?" The dissolution began with a pious lie. Royal inspectors were sent to investigate corruption in the monasteries. They found what they were paid to find. An abbot with a mistress, a monk who drank too much, crimes that did exist, but were inflated to make each monastery appear to be a den of depravity. In March 1536, Parliament approved the dissolution of the smaller monasteries. 300 religious houses were closed in one fell swoop. But what happened next was looting, not renovation. Glastonbury Abbey, which had stood since the 6th century, was the first of the great ones to fall. The soldiers arrived at dawn. The monks were in the middle of matins when the doors were broken down. Abbot Richard Wating, 78, tried to protect the altar. He was dragged out and hanged from the top of Glastonbury Tor, from where he could see his abbey being looted. What followed was state-sponsored vandalism. One-year-old stained glass windows were broken and tied together. Tombs of saints were opened and their bones thrown to the dogs. In Canterbury, the shrine of Thomas Becket, England's holiest, was destroyed. The gold was melted down, the jewels shipped to London. The saints' bones were burned and the ashes scattered to the wind. But it wasn't just material wealth that was lost. York Minster's library contained 5,000 manuscripts, many unique in the world. They were used to light fireplaces. In Oxford, pages of ancient Greek texts were found being used to wrap fish at the market. The Prior of Worcester wept openly as he saw medical treatises, hand-copied for centuries, being torn to clean boots. The monks were expelled with a meager pension. Many were elderly. They had entered the order as children. They knew nothing but prayer and copying manuscripts. John Burrow, a monk for 60 years, was seen begging on the streets, still wearing his torn habit. When asked why he kept it on, he replied, "It's the only clothing I have, but the cruelest impact was on the poor." Monasteries were the social welfare system of medieval England. At Fountaineb, 2,000 people ate for free every day. The monastery maintained a hospital, a school, and a traveller's shelter. When it closed, these 20 people were simply left to starve. Mary Cholmondeley, a widow from Lincolnshire, walked 30 miles to London to beg the king. Her sick son was being cared for by the monks. Without them, he would have died. The guards wouldn't even let her near the palace. The boy died 3 weeks later. The confiscated lands were sold off at rock-bottom prices. to nobles who supported the king. In a single year, Henry created a new class of aristocrats, all owing their fortunes to the destruction of the church. They were the nouveau riche of the Dissolution, as the people scornfully called them. Robert Aske, a lawyer who witnessed the destruction of his local abbey, wrote, "Where there was once singing, there is now silence. Where there was charity, there is now greed. Where there was God, there is now gold." The people of the north watched their monasteries, many 500, 800 years old, turn to ruins in a matter of weeks. Stones were stolen to build mansions. The bells, which for generations had marked the hours of their lives, were melted down to make cannons. It was too much. In October 1536, when the commissioners arrived in Lout to close yet another abbey, they found something they hadn't expected. An angry mob armed with sickles and clubs, chanting a single word. No, the rebellion had begun. And this time it wasn't a few disgruntled nobles. It was the people, 40,000 ordinary Englishmen, marching not for power or gold, but for something that had been stolen from them. Their faith, their history, their identity. They called it a pilgrimage of grace. Henry would call it treason. It began with the ringing of a church bell in Lincoln's, when royal commissioners arrived to confiscate the silver chalice from the parish of Lout. The sacristan climbed the tower and rang the alarm bell. It was the same bell that warned of fires or invasions. Within minutes, 300 people surrounded the church. Within hours, there were thousands. The news spread like wildfire. From village to village, from county to county, the bells rang and the people marched. They weren't soldiers. They were blacksmiths, weavers, farmers, millers. They carried what they had: wood-chopping axes, foiches, even iron pots. But they had an unlikely leader. Robert Aske wasn't a warrior. He was a 36-year-old lawyer, a scavenger, who limped on one leg. But when he spoke, people stopped to listen. "We are not rebels," he declared. "We are pilgrims. We march for Christ, for the church, and to save the souls of the king and our children." As transformed a mob into a disciplined army, prohibited looting, and ordered everyone to wear a badge, the 5 wounds of Christ embroidered on their chests. Each man swore not to shed Christian blood unnecessarily. It was a rebellion that prayed before marching. Within 3 weeks, they controlled all of northern England. York, the kingdom's second largest city, opened its gates without resistance. Lincoln surrendered. The army of the northern kingdom, only 8,000 strong, was cornered in Pontefract Castle. Surrounded by 40,000 pilgrims, AS's demands were clear: restore the monasteries, dismiss Cromwell and the reformist bishops, and return to obedience to Rome. But there was something deeper. A Durham blacksmith explained why he was marching. "My grandfather helped build our abbey. My father is buried there. My children learned to read from the monks. Now they want to transform everything in dust. If we don't fight now, what will we say to God when he asks why we let his house be destroyed?" Henry VI was terrified. For the first time in his reign, he faced not a conspiracy of nobles, but his own people. And they were winning. The Duke of Norfolk, sent to negotiate, wrote to the king, "Your Majesty, they are many and determined. If we attack, I am not sure of the loyalty of our own soldiers." So Henry did what he knew best. He lied, sent a letter promising a general pardon. He said he would listen to their grievances, that a parliament would be convened in the north to discuss reforms. He even sent a blessed crucifix as a sign of good faith. Aske believed him. After all, it was the word of a king anointed by God. On Christmas Day 1536, Robert Aske dined with the Duke of Norfolk. They drank wine, laughed, and discussed the terms of peace. Then he ordered his men to return home. The king listened. He said, "We won without shedding blood." It was the mistake that would cost thousands of lives. In January, small groups tried to keep the rebellion alive. It was the excuse Henry was waiting for. They broke the truce. He declared it. 200 men were hanged at Carlisle. In every village that had supported the pilgrimage, at least one man was executed. The bodies were left to rot on the gallows as a warning. Robert Aske was invited to London Sob. Henry welcomed him, smiled, even gave him gifts. Then he imprisoned him. At his trial, Aske said, "If I have betrayed anyone, it was my people by believing the word of a king." He was sentenced to be dragged through the streets of York, the city he had liberated. Then he was hung in chains in York Castle, not hanged quickly, but left to die slowly of thirst and exposure. It took days, Passers-by could hear him praying until his voice broke. The other leaders suffered worse fates. Thomas Darcy, 70, was beheaded. John by God quartered alive. Lady Margaret Boehmer burned at the stake for convincing her husband to join the Pilgrims. Even monks who merely gave food to the rebels were executed. But the cruelest punishment was enforced silence in every church in the north. Priests were forced to read a declaration every Sunday for a year. Rebellion is a sin against God and the king. Those who died are in hell. A witness in Yorkshire wrote, "Where once there were 40,000 voices singing, now there is only the wind blowing through ruins. The north was not conquered, it was broken." The Pilgrimage of Grace was the last great attempt to resist the English Reformation. Afterward, the people learned a terrible lesson. Their king preferred to rule over cemeteries rather than negotiate with the living. And so the England they knew, with its church bells and processions, its monks and charity, vanished not with a bang but with a whisper of fear. This fear had an address, a name and a face. At Hampton Court, while bodies still swung from the gallows of the north, Henry danced with his new queen, Jane Seymour. The nobles smiled, toasted, and applauded the king's every word, but beneath their silk robes, everyone was sweating cold. For the court of 1536 was a theatre where a slip of the tongue meant death. Lord Rochford, Anne Boleyn's brother-in-law, had been executed for allegedly making a joke about the king's virility. Now no one laughed too loudly, nor was anyone too quiet. Silence too was suspicious. The Duke of Suffolk slept with a dagger under his pillow, not for fear of assassins, but for fear of being arrested during the night. Lady Mary Howard confessed in a letter that she vomited before every royal banquet, out of nervousness. Everyone knew Henry had spies among the servants. A coachman could be an informant. A lady-in-waiting could be taking notes. Meanwhile, in the villages, life followed a completely different rhythm. In Oxfordshire, where a year before the bells had called for 3 daily masses, there was now silence. St. Mary's Church had walls as white as bones. The statues of the saints had been broken. Where the gilded altar had once stood, there was now a simple wooden table. Father Thomas Ashby, 60, who had served the parish for 3 decades, now read sermons in English he didn't fully understand. The words came out broken, shaky. The congregation, accustomed to Latin they didn't understand but which sounded sacred, now heard ordinary words speaking of God. "It sounds like blasphemy," a woman whispered. Her neighbor silenced her with a look. Walls had ears, but it was in homes that fear showed its cruelest face. William Carpenter, a blacksmith in Kent, had a 12-year-old daughter who asked, "Dad, is Grandma in heaven or hell?" Her grandmother had died a Catholic a year earlier. So under the new law, unsaved Catholics went to hell. But when William said that about his own mother, he replied, "I don't know, dear. The girl told me at school." The teacher reported that William was being questioned for heresy. Families were divided. In Somerset, 2 brothers stopped speaking. One had accepted the Reformation, the other kept a hidden rosary. When their mother died, they argued at the funeral over how to bury her. The terrified priest held 2 ceremonies, a Protestant one in the morning, a hidden Catholic one at night. Margaret Shane, the wife of a London merchant, developed a code with her Catholic friends. They embroidered pillows with symbols. A rose meant a secret mass in that house this week. A lily meant danger, spies nearby. A bird meant a Catholic priest was hiding, ready to administer last rites. The children were the most confused. John Hayward, 8, was beaten by his father for making the sign of the cross. "That's papism," his father shouted. But his grandmother, when his father wasn't around, taught the boy to pray the Hail Mary in a whisper. "It's our secret with God," she said. In the taverns, conversations changed. Before, they discussed saints' miracles, which relic was most powerful. Now they talked about the weather, the harvest, anything but religion. A York merchant wrote, "We drink more and talk less. Silence is the only protection." Even love was watched. Thomas Broke wanted to marry Alice Dan, but she was from a secretly Catholic family. The marriage might arouse suspicion. They waited 3 years until they were sure no one was watching. They were married in a Protestant ceremony, but years later, she confessed that she had been mentally reciting Catholic prayers while the minister spoke. Fear created a new England, one where neighbors distrusted neighbors, where children could denounce parents, where conscience itself was a crime unless aligned with the king. Jane bit Henry, the son she so desperately wanted, Edward, but died in childbirth. The king wept for 3 days, then remarried. And England? England learned to survive, to pray without moving her lips, to believe without showing it, to live in fear as if it were normal. Because in 1536, normality had died along with Thomas More, with Robert Aske, with the thousands who dared to say no. When Henry VI died in 1547, he left behind an unrecognizable England. 3,000 executions, 800 destroyed monasteries, countless manuscripts lost forever. But true legacy is not measured in numbers. It is measured in silence. The silence of generations who learned that survival was more important than belief, that obedience was safer than questioning, that power, when dressed as religion, becomes absolute and unquestionable. England would never be Catholic again. Even when Mary Tudor tried to restore the ancient faith by burning 300 Protestants, the trauma was too deep. The people had learned that religion was politics, and politics was death. But something was born from the ashes of 1536, a nation that owed no obedience to any foreign power, a language, English, that replaced Latin in the churches and would become the language of the greatest empire the world has ever seen. A healthy distrust of absolute authority that centuries later would inspire democratic revolutions. The price. Ask the nameless bones in the mass graves of Yorkshire. Ask the 1,000-year-old pages used to light bonfires. Ask Robert Aske, whose body rotted in chains because he believed the word of a king. 1536 teaches us that when absolute power dons the mantle of divine truth, when questioning becomes treason, when individual conscience is crushed by the state, it's not just freedom that dies, it's humanity itself. Today, when we see leaders mixing politics with religion, when we see absolute truths being imposed, when we see fear being used to silence, let's remember 1536. Let's remember that it took just 2 years to transform England from a Catholic kingdom into a religious dictatorship. 2 years to normalize the unthinkable. The question isn't whether it would happen again. The question is, would we recognize the signs in time? Closure. If this journey through England's darkest year of faith has moved you the way it has me, researching every execution, every betrayal, every life lost, then you need to see what's appearing on your screen now. It's about another moment in history where the unthinkable became normal, where ordinary people had to choose between survival and maintaining their humanity. Trust me, once you discover what happened in 1536, you'll never look at power the same way again. Oh, and if you've made it this far, you're clearly not someone who settles for superficial versions of history. You want the truth no matter how uncomfortable. So subscribe, because every week I bring you stories that textbooks chose to hide. Stories that explain why the world is the way it is today. And tell me in the comments, if you had lived in 1536, would you have sworn loyalty to the king to survive? Or would you have chosen to die for your convictions? There is no wrong answer, but your answer says a lot about who you are. Share this video with that friend who thinks they understand history. I guarantee 1536 will change their perspective on power, religion, and survival. The video on the screen is starting in 5 seconds. It's not fiction. It happened. And the explanation will chill your blood. See you there, M.